Excellent. This is what I believe Peter would have said were he here. And for those of you who've taken our training, particularly law and administration, you may remember that one of the sessions is to go through the history of medicines law and look at all the dreadful things that have happened that have then led to our legislation. And this is one of those images that you will have seen. Obviously, Egypt started off with a really good knowledge of the human body due to mummification, and their knowledge and understanding passed through to the Greeks. And at the Greeks level, you get into the ability to apply rational thought. We're not quite claiming that the gods are responsible for everything anymore. We're looking for some sort of reason why these issues exist. And we have the Hippocratic Oath, which is based on having ethical activities and honesty. And that rings true even today. And yet we're looking at, many years BC or pre-Common Era, as I believe I'm now required to say. But we go back that far and you start to have the controls, and through time, we start looking seriously at our poisons and how we're going to have control of those, because we really shouldn't go around poisoning people. And that's something that we would like to avoid, and we would like to avoid the hangings associated with that. But, that's life, or not. And coming forward to the UK, we get to the well-known hypochondriac, Henry VIII, and he was very interested in applying modern thought and the application of good controls, and included the inspection of apothecaries. So we would not have truly rotting materials, we would actually have something fresh and what it was meant to be. So from that point onwards, it kind of escalates through time, and we come to our modern era, and when we are manufacturing on a much larger scale, and we start looking at really quite serious issues that require the law to come into place or to be amended. So sulfanilamide was a very well-known cough medicine, and always in a powder format. And when it was made into a syrup with what we would call antifreeze, it clearly led to a number of deaths, and it also identified how there was no real knowledge as to where the medicines were. You can read about the inability to apply a recall and how people lied about what sort of amounts they had used. And even when they were faced with the reality it could have been recalled before somebody else took it, they still held to lies rather than fess up that they had had some of this material. Ethical behaviours, honesty, does ring true all the way through, I'm afraid. But we get in and onwards into the heparin and thalidomide. The heparin clearly is an adulteration on bulk. And these things have led to the Falsified Medicines Directive, and we have the continued change. Peter would attempt to look to the future. None of us are actually able to tell what the future is. We are driven largely by politics, and we cannot tell what might happen in a year or two. And therefore, we're not guaranteeing this, but it is a look to where we are and what might be, and understand why there's those changes, what's driving those changes, and also look to the legislation and guidance that you may hope to see. Now, I'm sure you're quite familiar with the GOF compliance hierarchy. And the GOF compliance hierarchy recognises that most of us are down here at our policies and procedures level, but we build that based on significant amounts of help. And the highest level of help is the law and the regulatory guidance. That's what we have got to do. Then you have those professional documents in between that sort of point us in the right direction. We've got the consensus standards, the IPEC type of documents, particularly for excipients. We have the involving interpretations, attending conferences where speakers from the FDA, from the EMA are speaking, will give you a very good idea of what's happening and where we're headed. And then, of course, there's professional guidance, the ISP documents that will be amazingly useful for anyone who wishes to actually build a factory, run a factory. And you can see that the FDA is channeling through change, through helping with ISPE guidances, or maybe just reviewing but not commenting, perhaps. But you can see that the spirit that the industry is looking to go in is actually within those documents in terms of guidance with regards quality culture, the excellence of that, and the quality maturity management elements. But we're focusing today on the law and the regulatory guidance of this GOF compliance hierarchy. And we'll be looking through the shortages of medicines, because those are really beginning to have a very, very serious impact in not just the UK. We've had a critical medicines list for many years, which you're not allowed to export. But during COVID, it became apparent that across Europe, there was a massive imbalance. And then we can look out to the States, where I think it's 309 medicine shortages by the end of September this year. Now, I know it's a huge country, but still, that's quite a significant number. We look at the international cooperation and what is being moved forward in what is a truly global industry. And we need to take the leverage from other countries and have the ability to use work that's been done well, maybe not exactly as we would have done it, but actually the outcome is likely to have the same end result. And so you can see that acknowledgement that just because you don't do it like I would, that doesn't necessarily make it wrong. And there's more and more consolidation of that approach towards cooperation. Undoubtedly, we're at a time of good change with regards to the potential for different ways to manufacture and deliver products. Let's face it, continuous manufacturing has been talked about for decades. I've probably only ever heard of one company claiming to do it properly, and even then they seem to have an unusual approach towards what was continuous, because they were doing a pre-batch and then a bit of continuous, and then they were packing on batches. So, you know, we don't really see it on a significant scale everywhere you go, but without a doubt, it is going to make life, I think, more economically sensible in the future. But also we've got the point of care changes, and Jan Rees, I'm pleased to say, will talk about that properly. I'll give you a bit of an intro. But there's also environmental health concerns that's significantly changing the way we're going to have to work. And it's not always obvious at the moment how we're going to accommodate those changes. There is, of course, AI, and at this point, I will sort of say, I'm not the computer person, I'm not really sure, but it looks a bit scary to me. And then undoubtedly, there's politics, and no presentation from Peter would go without mentioning Brexit. So we'll have a look at the drivers in this and what's going on. So within the United States, the risk management plans are going to be required so that you have a pre-think about what are likely to be your drug shortages. Where are your weaknesses in your supply chain? You will have seen ICHQ9 Revision 1 has a new section on controlling the potential weaknesses within your supply chains. And within the companies now, FDA are requiring or will require you to have risk management plans so that you can mitigate. It is with the same similar approach within the EU, and there is the proposed regulation that will have in place the need to control the shortages and to make sure that you've got a shortage prevention plan. So that's going to be something that's going to have to be better than our best guess. It's going to have to be supported by, true knowledge of your operations, where you can shorten your supply chains and bring in better levels of control. If we look within European regulations, the 2022-123, it's a nice, easy one to remember that, but what it is always a problem. The number's good, but in that regulation, you do have a new role for the EMA to be the coordinator for medicine supplies. And they are looking to have the European Shortages Monitoring Programme, and that's beginning to be put in place. And they're going to make sure that they can understand what the demand is across the European Union and where the flows are. Should be operational from 2025. Now, it's also possible that we're going to have an EU Critical Medicines Act. And at some point, you have to look at the global situation and recognise that there are some medicines that ought to be manufactured and controlled within your own control. The question is going to be, will anyone be actually willing to pay for that? So, will we, decide that it is worth within Europe to have manufacturing on that area and in their own control? I don't think that's going to help the UK because, let's be honest, if they block the export of these essential medicines, we can't even argue on the basis of parallel importation that that's going to be viable. So that Critical Medicines Act, it's unclear yet whether it will happen. But if it does, I think we will see certain medicines identified as essential and look to have manufacturing within your own countries. The United States, as I said, there's, is it 305 drug shortages by the end of September this year? And that has a significant impact on patients, which the FDA would like to ameliorate. They have been issuing drug shortages reports, and the one for 2019 identified the three root causes. There is a lack of incentive to manufacture less profitable drugs. And I think there has to be a debate around periods of exclusivity and how you manage the relative profits from drugs. It's beginning to have that discussion in Europe, but undoubtedly, if that happens in Europe, that discussion will go globally. Market does not recognise and reward manufacturers for having a mature quality system. And by this, if you've got a good quality system, you should have less nasty events and less shortages or stockouts. In a theoretically perfect world, you'll have a proactive quality system, you will look for where there are potential weaknesses, and you'll put controls in place before those events occur. Whether we'll ever reach that perfect world where we're looking proactively rather than spending, 20% of our time writing deviations, I'm not quite sure. But certainly there has to come a time where the proactive approach has got to have more value, more time than the vast amount of time that is spent on investigating, writing and approving the deviations, which is all really negative work and will not help us to improve our systems really. Everyone would like to believe that we're going to put in place really good corrective actions, but what we actually do is put in things that are approvable. So we'll say, we'll update that procedure, we will train that person. We don't ever really do a fundamental overhaul of that part of the process and look at what is truly intrinsically bad about it and make it better. But if you're going to start out with a process, you should do that proactive work, have your control systems in place. And I know it sounds a little bit magical, hypothetical land, but if we even did 10, 20% of that, it would make life, I think, a lot easier on the shop floor. If we look at the logistics and the regulatory challenges that are making market entry difficult, there are always opportunities, I think, for simplification, and the regulators have as much obligation to do that as everybody else. And we know what can be done when it needs to be done, when it is truly critical. Amazing things can happen. But if we could just get to a steady state that was an improvement from our baseline, I think everybody would be grateful for that. We need to address those root causes, so the FDA have looked at having a shared understanding of the true impact of drug shortages and truly get people to engage in the fact that it has significant impact to the patients. And then the FDA are looking to develop a rating system. And we know companies that are already involved in the sort of dummy runs for this, so that they will incentivize the drug manufacturers to truly invest in quality management. There is a document called a MAP document, MAPP, and Peter shared with us recently that this is forming the basis of how the agency looks at companies within the States. And they have looked for companies to, of course, comply with the basic minimum requirements, but fundamentally to reward those companies that go above and beyond. Because a company shouldn't aim for the minimum level of compliance. They should enable themselves to have, something beyond the basic essentials. And that sort of proactive work, really recognising what ICHQ 10 is all about and having that plan, do, check, act at many levels of the operation, is what will hopefully drive a more mature quality system. But in addition, they're going to look at promoting sustainable private sector contracts, to look and ensure that there is that reliable supply, which means probably they're going to be identifying those critical drugs for the states and ensuring that production within a truly accessible supply chain, because we are impacted globally rather more than we'd like. But this systems rating would make sure that there was transparency. So are they actually saying they're going to publicise what these ratings are? I'm not sure that publicly the MHRA issue their risk ratings of sites. I'm not aware of that at all. So the idea that this is going to impact transparency in the market, I think is going to make people wake up quite a lot. Nobody wants to be given the 2 out of 5 for the food ratings when you go out for dinner. I would reject that restaurant. So, in a country where in America you can certainly choose which medicines you're going to buy, I think looking at the transparency rating will become every neurotic person's new way of deciding which medicines they're going to get. But in addition, they're looking to actually give those companies that are truly making the right steps, give those competitive advantage so that they can have a more guaranteed operation. So that situation of the shortages driving change, as I've said, has led to this proposal of the quality management maturity model. And within this, they're looking for excellence on the quality culture side. They want to make sure that there are that spirit of continual improvement, and that you make sure that the senior management, as we would call it, are having that appropriate oversight. Because we want to make sure we minimise the risks to product availability. And that's really only going to come when you recognise that that balance between customer service, between our quality unit and our delivery, those are within a limited boundary of what you can provide. And you have to balance out the elements of manufacture, of profit, of the quality. And when we get those in a good state of balance, you have an operation that can continue to supply more frequently. The model, as I said, pulls in ICHQ 10 and is really looking for that Plan, Do, Check, Act at every level of the systems. And it's going to hopefully lead to a model where companies engage in a more positive way rather than looking to be at the minimum levels of compliance. So the second set of interest from Pete was the international cooperation. And he's identified a little bit of a timeline for us. The ICH is really where you look back to for the first true, I would say, cooperation. And at that point in 2003, Peter attended a meeting where they were looking to discuss true cooperation. And the representatives from Japan, Europe, and America on the industry side had come together. They'd done a coordinated presentation for an hour because everybody had 20 minutes. But the regulatory members from the three had 3 individual presentations, really showing there wasn't that cooperation within the regulators. And it was a true wake-up moment for the group because they recognised there was great value in the fact that industry had got together and had begun to drive forwards into what industry needed in a coordinated way. And so from there, in 2005, the EMA created an international liaison role. And the first person to have that role was Emma Cook, who is now, of course, the head of the EMA. And in that role, they started to really work towards a consolidated way of working, which we get out of ICH. And as an ex-inspector, whether I was in the States, whether I was in Europe, whether I was in India, everybody had done their analytical method validation the same way. They all knew what that ICH document called for, and I was able to actually have a good, sensible conversation regardless of where I was. And I think that is the key value of that cooperation. We all know what good looks like. We should all be doing what good looks like. And I think the benefits of that clearly were found. We've got the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, and that drives, I believe, the heads of medicines agencies, but probably they're separate, but it's just in my head they're joined. I think Jan might be able to answer that question for me. But that organisation, again, is driving forward true cooperation. And then the reformed ICH, when it moved from a conference to a council that kept the same initials, they have just grown beyond recognition from those first three countries. And we now have 21 members and 35 observers, all coordinating and working so that we've got common systems. When we're looking for the regulatory reliance, I said at the start that we need to be able to leverage the work that others have done. And it might not be exactly ABC as we would have done. They may have done 1, 2, 3, but ended up in the same location. And where that's possible, we can move towards using that information. And certainly from the UK, in our position of outside the European Union, we are accepting the decisions from a broader group of countries now than we would have done previously. I think that has to reflect the fact that you've still got to deliver, your part in that. But if we look at the new ways to manufacture, we can look first at point of care, and I'm sure you're familiar following the consultations. But the outcome of that consultation was available, I think, earlier this year, and you can see that we've got this potential for bedside manufacture. And this is a model that really builds on what happens with gases, what happens with the blood industry, and how you have centralized control sites that are responsible for a number of production sites. They'll be responsible for the quality system at those sites, for the training of the people involved, for the investigation of any issues that occur, and certainly all that reporting from those production areas. They'll set up what is the batch manufacture record to look like and make sure that they have a sensible level of approval on them. But from a regulatory point of view, there will be an authorisation, and there'll be a master file that will detail all of these point of care manufacturing sites, because they could be changing depending on where the need is, where the requirement is. You don't want to have to do a new application for your license every single time. So you maintain a master file and allow a bit more flexibility. But that point of care consultation, as I said, January of this year, the outcome came from it. And there's great support for this process. And I guess when they get someone to write the new rules, that will be published. So we'll look to that, but it will, I guess, require the agency to have people who can write it. The United States the EU are now looking to do very much the same model. Essentially, it's the same thing, but with slightly different words. And they issued their decentralized model in April. And it is essentially the same approach. And that just shows how well thought through the UK approach was, and that it's a good and logical, flexible model that will allow that point of care manufacture to happen within a controlled operation, because you can't just have these things happening randomly, no one being trained, no one having procedures. So the FDA have got a distributed and point of care drug manufacturing consultation, and the frame model is something like advanced manufacturing excellence, but I'm afraid I don't remember the F and the R at this point. But the essence of it is, how are you going to have that modernized manufacture going forwards? And certainly there is that plan for that to happen within the States. Very similar approach, very similar mentality. We can then move on to the environmental and health concerns. And this is in some ways the sort of less predictable element. It's not so long ago that the European Food Agency banned titanium dioxide. Nobody really knows why, what was the rational basis of that. No other country has chosen to do so or believes it's necessary. And so this is the sort of, outside change that none of us have control over. I believe there was a plan to ban it more widely, and that was stopped within the courts because there was no evidence to support the need to do so. So you can see that these environmental drivers will be impacting us, and we may not necessarily see them coming. The proposed ban on the polyfluoroalkyl substances, that's an interesting one because, of course, our most well-known of these is PTFE, which I defy you not to find in your factories, not to find in your operations. Anywhere doing biologicals will be using it, and it's a really commonly used substance within our industry. So what we would do if that got banned, I'm not quite sure. All your single-use manufacture systems are likely to be affected, and it will have a significant impact. But in addition, we'll be looking at environmental risk assessments, having to accompany your marketing authorizations. And so we're going to have that broader level of understanding within our companies, probably bring in environmental scientists to support that approach. Just as we had to adopt toxicologists more actively when the cleaning validation became changed, I would say. If we look to artificial intelligence, there is without a doubt a driver to get in at the regulatory level and to look at how to control, how to understand, and how to ensure that this is done in a relatively considered manner. Without a doubt, the devices world is ahead of the manufacturing products. And you can see the UK's MHRA issued an AI sandbox, I think last month. And so the idea will be that you'll be able to have your AI data within this sort of modelling system. And as you develop it, you'll be working with the regulators and ensure that it's all transparent as you go. Because the software as a device is common, and AI is commonly being used within that, reportedly. But you can see that it's going to affect us, and you can see that there's consultation now for the EMA's reflection paper through to the end of the year. And there will be a need to understand what's the basis of your decision making. And at a certain point, we're going to see that need to be able to have people explain how does that work and what's the impact on it from a GMP point of view. And that's the bit where life gets interesting. The FDA discussion paper was published, and they're looking for areas for amendments, looking at how it will impact process design and setup, scale up, the advanced process controls, monitoring and fault detection, and trend monitoring. And you get into this concepts of data lakes and how are you allowing data into that lake? What are you excluding from the lake is the more important question. You make a decision not to include certain batch data, but is that true and fair and rational, or actually should it be included even if it makes your lake look a little bit bad? Because actually you might need those negative batches to be a true representation of what's going on. But the artificial intelligence has a very broad and potential impact. And certainly as we're looking at how that's going to affect us, we're looking at human-led governance, accountability and transparency. I learnt about in silico recently, and I'm sure people in the room will know a lot more about it than I do, but it's the Silicon Valley. It's the idea of being in the computer, and within development and the world of research and development is used widely, and you have to be able to show where your data has come from as you model what's happening in the human body and try to replace, particularly in vivo testing, with a mathematical model. And the idea of that, if you think about it, where could that data have come from that's in the model? How can you replicate it? How can you show the source and the origin of it? Is going to be where this human-led governance is going to have to come in, because we're going to always have to be able to replicate and recreate, if you like, the model that you're going to be using. But that reliability and representativeness of the data is key, and how you develop your model, how it works, how you monitor it, validation in the concept of a mathematical model. I wish you well. So it's a really positive engagement, I think, with data. But we must get to the point where humans can interpret and explain it. And that was Adam Fisher speaking at an international conference. Just as when you're doing development of any computer system, there's a point when you have to say, right, where we are in our modelling is what we're actually going to deliver for a GMP purpose. That is what we're going to have to qualify. So we get to the final part of what's impacting us, and we're looking to politics here. It is, without a doubt, a challenge in terms of ensuring that supply chains are strong. You'll know that Peter has a particular Brexit, I think, B, shall we say, but the impact on us cannot be ignored. And the reality of how those supply chains work and whether they work is going to impact us really, for the future. And I can't see that changing, smoothly, completely for a while. And the impact, as every pack needs to be updated and changed, is massive and should never be underestimated. As we are using our own legislation, we've got the Medicines and Medical Devices Act in place, and we're able to have those consultations and changes. And we've already done that for the clinical trials, the veterinary, and for the point of care. At some point, there needs to be some sort of a decision over the end-to-end traceability and whether we're going to do that in the UK or not. And presumably, there must be a consultation for that at some point. But as the agency is endeavouring to, I guess, to some degree, manage that post-Brexit change within the agency, they're also, being looked to make these changes to our regulations. And that ability to cope at that time when you've lost really a significant proportion of your technical staff, I think is going to be challenging. I would suggest probably it will take them at least 2 to 3 years to stabilise, given the number of technical roles that have moved on. And then at that point, hopefully, we can return to some degree of business as normal, rather than having to have particular projects to bring down, the very long cycle times that they were experiencing in some areas. You can't have emergency projects on every aspect of your business. You've got to have a stable way of running. So in summary, we're looking at really quite profound changes driven by the shortages, driven by global change. The reality of the change of the manufacturing and the computer world is going to impact us. And it will happen in a way, just as Kodak got driven out for being out of business and out of style, it will happen in a way that we probably can't foresee. And we won't know which companies will be the ones that come forward, that take over, that truly thrive in a time of change. But what we do know is that the fundamentals of GMP are there for a very good reason, and they should not be ignored with any degree of casualness. And I think we have to keep remembering that they were written because horrible things happened, and we are endeavouring to prevent those horrible things from happening again. That's possibly not the way that Peter would have worded it, but I hope that you can see the spirit of his presentation. And if you've got any really good and really challenging questions for the future, let me know and we can email him. Okay, thank you very much.